Everybody, good morning.
Good morning.
You know, I'm going to be up here a lot with you guys today. I was just saying hi to a few folks in the front row. I love front row people, but I also like back row people. And so I hope, you know, many of you are really in this business and industry. I've been enjoying the conversation with you when we were having coffee. So I hope you're active. I hope you ask questions. I hope we can turn this into a bit of a salon as we're doing. Senator, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Great to be here.
I want to be honest with the crowd that part of the reason that we're doing this forum came out of a discussion I had with Senator Warner about his desire to take an event into Silicon Valley, across the street from Google and Apple and Facebook, although they're not really all together, and have a conversation with their employees. And to tell the employees, look, you don't get what you're not performing in the social contract you have with America's citizens. So why don't we take that as first starting point? Because I was so intrigued with that framing. What do you think the deficits are in the technologies world's, particularly the social media's world's, social contract with America today?
Well, let me step back. Some people may know my background. I was 20 years in the tech business, co-founder of Nextel, then a VC. So I think I brought at least some understanding of the field. And I think for a lot of the last 7, 8, 9 years, there's been this huge infatuation with the tremendous growth in tech. Frankly, the Obama administration had a love affair with Google, and less so with Facebook, Twitter at all. And I still remember in the aftermath of the 2016 campaign, when it started to become evident to me that the bad guys had come in and started to misuse some of the social media platforms, and I raised these issues. And Mark Zuckerberg's original comment was, if anybody in Washington thinks the Russians were messing with our stuff, they must be stupid. That did not prove to be the case. And I think there was a real reluctance amongst the social media companies to acknowledge, while there's been a great community that's been built, there's a huge dark underbelly that has been created in these communities that we still are exploring its breadth and extent. There was recent data we had from John Kelly, one of the experts that I turn to occasionally. I guess it's kind of good news and bad news, that says that the political dialogue in our country on the far left and the far right is actually 25 to 30 to 1, either bots or foreign-directed bots over actual Americans. So it made me feel a little bit good, like there's not as many whack jobs on each end of the political spectrum as it might appear. But I think there is a responsibility that these companies have as communities are built online, as information is relayed, as increasingly we found some companies have manipulated and sometimes misuse our private personal information. One of the reasons why, when we had our hearing last week, which I was happy to see was not Internet 101, unlike some of the previous hearings on the Hill, there was an acknowledgement from Facebook of two things, which I hope we'll be able to pursue. One, that Facebook ought to be willing to share all of the personal information they collect about each one of us and how they then monetize that in terms of sales from an advertising standpoint. And two, if we as consumers can get a handle on that kind of monetization, what our information is worth, it might change the whole debate, because I think most Americans think, oh my gosh, Facebook, Google, Twitter, this is all free. It's not free. These companies, and I'm not saying maliciously, are using our personal information to monetize it. If we could have that knowledge, one of the possibilities is there might be new competition entered into the market whereby some enterprise might, in effect, intercede between you as the user and the platform and say, all right, if Steve Clemens' data is worth $12 a month to XYZ platform company, maybe you might be willing to say, I'll give $2 of that to some other entity to help guard, protect, or utilize your data so we don't have to go with the maybe over-the-top, heavy-handed European approach.
Right. When Mark Zuckerberg made the comment about Russia when he did, was he lying or did he not know?
I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I've known Mark a long time, that he was just ignorant. it is hard sometimes for a company that knows as much as it does about both of us, that they did not realize there were foreign entities manipulating their platform. And the change from, and let me make 2 quick points here, the change from where they were in November, December, and let me also add, they've made dramatic strides. Last week when Cheryl was here, they really have moved a long way. But where they moved from saying, hey, we got no problem here, in November, December of 16, to by the time the French elections, presidential elections came on in roughly March, April of 17, where they were then bragging about the fact that they had taken down 30,000 accounts that were directed by Russians, showed that they got religion pretty quick. It is one of the things, though, that still bothers me on a level of scale. In France, they bragged about 30,000 accounts they've taken down. In the United States, in terms of IRA, which is only one component of the Russian attack, IRA, Internet Research Agency, outsourced oligarch activities, they still have only identified 470 accounts that were directly Russian related. Now those accounts, and here's where we again made a huge mistake on the front end, we thought the action at the beginning was the paid advertising. The paid advertising is the tiniest part of the problem. The paid advertising is tiny compared to the creation of fake identities, fake accounts that then create masses of followers. The advertising can push individuals to those accounts, but those accounts, as they start on, Alabama football, then morph into a pro-Russian or, in many cases, just anti-American propaganda machine.
I recently interviewed Anders Anslip, who is the High Commissioner for Digital Economy in Europe, right before the GDPR regulations came in. And I asked him whether, on the eve of these regulations coming into Europe, whether Europe in this regulatory environment would ever itself give birth to a Google or a Twitter or one of the large social media platforms. And he said basically no. I mean, he's Estonian, he's a big fan of the United States. He says, we've created an environment where essentially we need the United States to innovate and we Europeans will regulate. Have we reached a period when that's there? And I ask you this as a former CEO in a way, because, and I like the way you began your conversation, that as a former CEO, you understand the kind of dimensions of growth and how we do that. But had we had the environment we seem to be moving into, we're not there yet in terms of what the law may end up being on privacy and data management, et cetera, whether or not these social platforms could get the sort of scale that has been successful. So there's a tension there that I'd like you to sort out.
There is a tension, and I do think the generation of GDPR in Europe, and I think the comment that was made earlier, where the Europeans have actually taken some time to try to wrestle with some of this, was partially driven by obvious concerns for European privacy. It was also had a little bit of an anti-American, we don't feel like the American tech companies are giving us enough answers and respect, and so consequently we're going to whack them with this broad-based appeal. I remember when the Brits at first refused, or didn't refuse. I remember a trip over to the UK and meeting with senior members of the British government when we were starting our Russia investigation, and they were saying, "Oh, Senator, it's awful what's happening, but of course we didn't have any of that in Brexit." And then, months later they realized, oh my gosh, yes, this has happened as well. And they started their own bipartisan parliamentary inquiry, and they literally brought a lot of the meetings over here to Washington. Their parliamentary commission met here because they felt like the American tech companies would send second or third rate people if they met in Europe. So I think it was both a combination of desire for privacy, a little bit of a kind of an economic nationalism whack against the Americans. And one of the things that I've tried, is somebody who still can claim for another year or two that I spent longer in business than I have in politics, I have no interest in overly regulating the internet. I have no interest in handicapping or retarding American innovation.
So you're not the Elizabeth Warren of the internet.
Your words, not mine. Because not only because I think these companies can add enormous value, but also because if we were to somehow, curtail these entities, what is behind those entities is not European competitors, but is Chinese competitors. I mean, if Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, and the one thing I think most American, even business leaders don't realize, that there are another dozen plus Chinese companies with $10 billion plus valuations that 99% of all Americans can't even name. So we would, to replace some of our forward-facing companies with Chinese enterprises that will have even less reason and frankly have even more, the one thing, maybe I've been spending too much time in skiffs on the in the Intel committee, but these companies, I believe, are all totally infiltrated by the Chinese government. In many ways are total pawns.
So the all is like 100%?
Like 100%, and their ability to kind of share information, share data with the government in a country that already has less kind of views on privacy than we do, means that when we're thinking about kind of next level battles around artificial intelligence, the move towards 5G technology, quantum computing, it gives China a real advantage if their companies dominate. And it also raises, with some of our American companies, real concerns I have. One, on the fact that some of these American companies, I think, sell their souls to get into the Chinese market.
Right.
And it more than bothers me, not only the fact that Google didn't have the courage to send somebody to our hearing, maybe because they didn't want to get asked questions not only about misuse of social media, but why are they negotiating with China to do a search engine in China that would adhere to Chinese censorship, or why are they doing joint AI development with a nation state that we may be.
So Google is certainly going to be in a committee hearing with you in the future. Is that going to be your first question to them?
Well, listen, I think again, we all know, the notion that the Valley, that everybody in the Valley kind of gets the world much better than anybody in the policymaking world, and they can ignore those of us in the policymaking world, those days are gone.
As you said, the Wild West is gone.
The thing is, if you simply look, and my numbers are, somebody fact check these, and they may be slightly off, but on scale, they're basically right. If you go back, 2, 3, 4 years, the level of positive feelings towards social media, the level of belief that it is basically benign, was somewhere around 3 or 4 to 1. If you take that same data, and particularly even looking at younger people, that number has almost reversed in terms of people's concern about social media, concern about accuracy and information. And so the 3 things that I felt that came out of our hearing last week, and because we didn't shout at each other, and because we actually had Democrats and Republicans working together, it didn't make as much news. But 3 policy areas that I'd like to explore. I've actually got a paper with a lot more ideas, but 3 that I think, and none of these are going to solve the problem, but I think they're worthy of some discussion. One is the notion of, should we, as Americans, as human beings, have the right to know when we are contacted by a post, whether that contact is actually coming from another human being or whether it's coming from a computer or a bot. Now there's nothing per se wrong with a bot. It doesn't bring a negative or positive connotation, but I do think people ought to have that ability to know that. Second, and this is where Facebook leaned in, and I hope they will continue to lean in, I think we ought to have that right to know, as I mentioned earlier, how much personal information they are collecting on us, have us know what they've collected and how they monetize that, so that if we as individuals will know how much our data is worth. And third is this whole area, and we picked a kind of obvious area where I think Facebook had to lean in, is, are there sites out there that are so insightful of violence that there's some obligation to take them down? We cited the site, obviously, in Myanmar, where there have been sites that have frankly encouraged Burmese to kill their fellow Burmese because they happen to be Muslim and Rohingya, and obviously an awful circumstance. And there was an acknowledgement, I believe, of both a moral and a legal obligation to take down those sites. So that gives us a few areas to start. I think let me just get one more in. I know Steve well enough to know when he's like saying, all right, Warner, cut it off. Let me get to the next question.
Getting close, but not.
Getting close, but let me, I think, because one of the areas we can look at, we can look at this from a privacy standpoint. We can look at it from a transparency standpoint. I do think the whole question of identity authentication, particularly on Facebook, which says they're supposed to be a real site, is a terribly important area. Although obviously we got to protect journalists, female journalists in Egypt, for example. But the other piece, is there an analogy to my old business in telecom where it's hard to have new competitors come in when the existing platforms monopolize all the information? So can we create data portability so we can move all your data in an easily usable form, including those wonderful cat videos you have, to a new site easily? Will that help create additional competition? Now, you'll need interoperability as well. The analogy being, it used to be really hard for those of you who are older than 40 will remember this, to move from one telco to another until we actually legislated number portability. I think some of this data portability may be another area for examination.
So I mentioned Elizabeth Warren in jokingly, but in a way, when you think about the world that she was in, of looking at consumer finance abuse and consumer protection, and looking at the fact that at least Congress at that time did not believe that these companies were ever going to put their consumer interests in a way forward on a broad public side. And it raises the interesting question, because you said you don't want to be that person, you don't want to move in that space. But are you having to hope that but let me just finish. I guess I want to get to a discussion about whether a law is going to happen, a bipartisan approach that creates a legal framework that eventually passes is something that can help at least get the rails on this discussion in the right place. There's the Mark Warner 20-point plan. The 20 points that
not all of them good ideas by any means.
You don't like your own points?
Well, I think there's some of them are contradictory. Actually, but it was just to spur the discussion.
Yeah. So so I'm interested in where you see the possibility of a law, what the framework will be, and you've emerged as a key voice. Senator Burr has as well in working with you on some of this. So what would that look like? What I don't want to do is, as somebody who was there at the creation of Dodd-Frank and believe very strongly in the protection of the Consumer Bureau. And actually, Elizabeth and I, this week was the 1-year anniversary of the Equifax hack, and I think it still is abysmal that a company that has that much power over as much private information as we have, that there has been no liability there. We actually have a joint piece of legislation about strict liability. So I'm not saying there does not need to be protections of people's information. Whether the European approach grants us that real protection or simply impedes innovation, I think the jury is out. So where I've looked at is one around more transparency, and so price transparency, data transparency, identity transparency, because my big concern is, we're talking a lot now about misinformation, but what I see as the next real challenge is the merger of the challenges in cyber along with misinformation, disinformation. So somebody will go out and hack Equifax, get that personal information about Steve Clemens. Someone will contact you with personal information. You will open that message, and you won't get a printed message. You will get a deep fake video of somebody who looks like me saying some ridiculous comment, or even worse in terms of market manipulation. So I think the transparency area is one. I do think there are privacy protections that I am wide open on, where we take what's good and what's not so good on the European basis. The idea of first-party consent only is something I think we ought to look at. And then there are this bucket, and this is an area that I don't think we've
we've spent enough time on, are there market mechanisms to drive more competition so that, you may have Facebook, you may have other Twitter, you may have other platforms, but there may be new platforms that would be created that offer you different sets of protections that you then as a consumer can choose where you want to convey these conversations and lead your social media life.
Do you think there are more things that we can do organically to build more of a compact between the Silicon Valley employees you're talking about and those that are using the machines and also regulating?
I think there is a growing recognition in the Valley from the workforce that they do bear a social responsibility. I mean, this is the way people communicate. This is the way, in many ways, people lead their lives on social media. And a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, from both the leadership on down to the workforce, I think there was not that acknowledgement. So I think from Zuckerberg to Jack Dorsey, again, I'm disappointed that Google has chosen not to be part of the conversation yet. I think they realize from both the concern about us coming in heavy-handedly regulating, but also just from the recognition that their user base is increasingly being suspect that the companies actually have users' best interests at heart. Now, I would love to have done, kind of a massive town hall with employees of all of the platforms and others to kind of say, hey, we're not all Luddites. Here, share ideas with us about how we get this right, because that's my fear, is that the platform companies may, say they think we're just simply going to go away, and then something bad will happen, and we will overreact. So let's do this. Let's do this in a collaborative way so far. And again, Twitter and Facebook at this point are fully engaged. We've already had serious follow-up meetings since our hearing on what substantive policy might look like.
Before I go to the audience, I want to ask you about what the president just issued the other day, sort of a surprising instruction to police and investigative authorities here to investigate foreign meddling in the upcoming elections and to punish. Is it real? Do you support what the president has put out, or is it not real?
In a normal world, i.e. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, in a normal world, after a foreign nation attacked our country at the core of our democracy, our electoral system, in a way that was more pervasive than I think any of you all know even. It attacked our election system, it attacked our voting system, it attacked and manipulated social media, it weaponized information in terms of breaking in to political accounts. And as we confirmed the intelligence community assessment, they did this in 2016 with the goal of hurting Clinton and helping Trump. In a normal world, you would have had someone that would have been designated at the White House level to be in charge of making sure there is appropriate election security going forward. We have not done that. And the only action that's taken place in a bipartisan fashion has come from our committee, where we've got some pretty decent legislation out there, where we got $380 million out to the state boards of election and local registrars, where they are upping their game on paper ballots. In a normal world, with the challenges that we have in the cyber domain, you would up your game there. You would not do what this president has done, which is eliminate the top person having cyber responsibility at the White House. I frankly think, as an aside, where we just passed $713 billion defense budget, I'm pro-defense, but I increasingly believe that we are buying the world's best 20th century military stuff, when most of the conflict in the 21st century will increasingly be cyber and misinformation and disinformation, and those merging, and frankly, with our near-peer competitors, China and Russia. They are our equals at least, and maybe in misinformation better. So did what the president do in this executive order, I think it was simply an attempt to preclude what Marco Rubio and Chris Van Hollen are trying to do, which is to take away that responsibility from the president and have automatic sanctions go in place the next time a foreign country intervenes into an election process, because I don't think we can count on this president, particularly vis-a-vis Russia, to actually step up and stand up against them. I mean, I would, Exhibit A is is Donald Trump kowtowing to Vladimir Putin in Helsinki on the world stage.
Powerful. With that, let me open the floor. Questions, comments, right here in the middle. This side, this gentleman here. Right here. White shirt, middle. Okay. Go to where I'm saying, right where I'm pointing. Yeah. Great. Hi.
Oh, sorry. Senator, I have a question. We're spending 80% operation and maintenance and 20% on federal IT for more advanced technology. 80% is a backdoor for any kind of halfway hacker to come in, i.e. OPM and others.
Right.
So what are we looking at as far as regulations or enhancements from the government to protect us against that? In other words, we need to modernize. Some of these systems are older than I am.
Great, thank you.
Bless you. Amen. It is, I remember when I was governor, it took us about 9 months to figure out how much the state of Virginia was spending on technology. I tried to do the same analysis at the federal level, and as you indicated, it's roughly low 80 billions, but as you said, 80% of that is on patches, upgrades of legacy systems. And those legacy systems, every time you patch, you add a new vulnerability. So, there's multi-year budgeting, being able to try to build in place, capital projects around large IT infrastructure purchases is one thing that we've been working on, frankly, with not very good success. So let me give you two, what should be low-hanging fruit that would help us move along. And this one is one that's so freaking low-hanging, and it's been, we've kind of moved the Chamber of Commerce to neutral, but they ought to be, frankly, pro. We are at this point over the next few years, the United States government, skip the American people, the United States government will basically buy about another 8 to 10 billion devices that are IoT connected. The remarkable thing is, we think about building all these new cybersecurity things on our power grid. Well, if the way you get into the power grid now is the microwave that's connected to the internet that's in the employee cafeteria, none of those devices have any basic security. So I've got bipartisan legislation with Cory Gardner that says, at least in terms of federal dollar spend, we ought to be able to have devices that are patchable, no embedded passcodes, de minimis level of security. And we can have even industry set it, but some of the low-end vendors are even fighting that. And that, we should all be, that is such a stupid vulnerability that we can easily correct. Connected as well to your question is, again, not a very sexy topic, but we desperately need, security clearance reform. We got a 700,000 person backlog on security clearance. I think Coates and others have made this higher. We can lower that number, get better people in, and part of that would also then move us towards not simply, when we make these purchases, lowest price technically available, but let's actually allow the government to be a little more innovative in its purchases and not simply buy from some of the large IT vendors that are more about patching as opposed to about innovation.
Senator, we're right at the end, but I want to ask you just as we wrap up here, thank you for that great question. How many Republican senators do you think you would have on a Mark Warner consumer privacy protection law?
I think, depending on how we framed it, I think we'd have a overwhelming majority, as long as we can say, all right, what did Europe get right? What did Europe get wrong? But there is enormous.
So you think there's a high chance?
I think there is a high chance that people realize that the days of the Wild Wild West are over, that there needs to be some guardrails. We need to do this in a thoughtful, forward-leaning way. And I would argue that the easiest starting point on these will be around knowledge of whether we're being communicated with by a human being or a bot, things around price transparency and data transparency. And I do think this area that there may be certain sites, and I think you can do this in a way that doesn't completely overturn Section 230 or completely go against the First Amendment, where there are certain sites that incite such violence that just as you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, you can't scream, go kill your neighbor, and say that's suddenly protected just because it's on the internet.
Interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Mark Warner. Thank you very much, Mark.